and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series and CDO to CDO podcast. I'm Chris Nur, Chief Digital Officer of Synity, a world leader in enterprise data software, and we're partnering with CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers to bring you this series of interviews with thought leaders in data and analytics. Today, it's my sincere pleasure to have as my guest Binu Verghese, Chief Data and Analytics Officer of the Carrier Corporation. Welcome, Binu. Great to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to our discussion. So let me jump right in, and I want to start by going a little bit back into history. So you started off your career doing what we all used to call data warehousing, which it sounds kind of quaint and old-fashioned now, although in my experience, it's still a big factor in large enterprises. Can you give us a sense from kind of an evolutionary standpoint, data and analytics platforms, what have the major changes been, and how well have those changes worked to deliver business value as the platforms have evolved from the kind of old-time data warehouse days?
Absolutely, Chris. I think, first of all, I think, yes, data warehousing today does sound quaint or old-fashioned or dated and all of that. But the moment you add the word cloud in front of it, it becomes topical and here and now again, right? That said, just reflecting back on the different generations of data platforms, if we sort of think back, late 90s are when data warehousing sort of became mainstream. And so at that point, there were two kinds of platforms to build your data warehouses on top of. You could choose to build it on top of regular databases like Oracle and SQL Server, or you could build it on top of purpose-built data warehousing appliances like Teradata, Netezza, Vertica, etc. Now, the problem with building it on top of regular databases was that those databases were optimized primarily for transactional workloads and not for data warehousing and analytics kind of workloads. Right? And so inevitably, when data volumes reached a certain stage, there were performance challenges and it would get hard to manage. Right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you went with purpose-built data warehousing platforms like Teradata, they would take care of the performance aspect with ease, right? They're all MPP systems. And so theoretically, if you double the nodes on a Teradata system, you've doubled the performance. But then handling the cost part of it was the challenge with that, right? And so a Teradata node was typically pulling together compute and storage. And so even if you just wanted to scale storage, you would end up buying more expensive compute as well, right? And back in the day, platforms like Teradata didn't quite come cheap, right? So that was a challenge back then. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point, and maybe just to add on that, and it's funny because we did some research in preparation for this, and I wanted to actually go back into the history, but I had almost forgotten how bad the performance problems could be. And then you had this sort of not only did you have this cost performance trade-off, but then you got into this thing where it was like there was a gap between operational reporting and data warehousing, and like everyone kind of wanted to do some combination of both, but it never really worked it moved the needle a lot, but it never really met the aspirations. So that's really interesting to remember. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great comment. And I'm thinking back to those days as well, right? And then fast forward a few years, and then internet became mainstream, social media became mainstream, e-commerce platforms became mainstream. And so there was such an explosion of not just data volumes, but also variety of data in terms of semi-structured and unstructured data, and also the velocity at which the data was getting generated on all of these platforms, right? And so now the problem to solve moved away from cost and became more of how do you handle the volume, velocity, and variety of data, right? And then around that time, late 2008, early 2009 is when Hadoop and the Hadoop ecosystem sort of came into existence, right? And then the promise of the Hadoop ecosystem was solving for the three V's, right? You had frameworks like MapReduce that could handle large volumes. You had, because of the schema on read kind of a philosophy, you could quickly ingest all kinds of data, semi-structured, structured, unstructured, onto the Hadoop platform. And then around, if I recall right, 2010, 2011, you also had components that could take care of the velocity piece, right? You had Kafka, Storm, all of those come in that could take care of real-time data use cases as well, right? Now, all of that was great, but the biggest challenge there was twofold. The first challenge was just setting up these platforms, configuring them. It was so complex and it was such a specialized task that there was just not enough of Hadoop admins to go around, right? And then the second challenge was that even if somehow you magically managed to set up a Hadoop environment, finding developers to write MapReduce code wasn't easy, right? And the rest of the Hadoop ecosystem was just about as complex, right? Then fast forward a few more years, I think the cloud data providers did a great job of solving one part of the complexity equation, right? So you had managed Hadoop instances on AWS, on Azure, on Google, right? So you have AWS EMR come in, HD Insights come in, etc., right? But then on the other end of the spectrum, you also had SQL on Hadoop platforms come in, right? So there was this realization that it's not enough to get data into Hadoop. You also have to be able to consume that data if you are to see any real value. And the business analysts, the data analysts, all of those folks who were familiar with SQL and SQL was their go-to tool couldn't hook up to Hadoop directly without a SQL-like interface, right? And that's when you saw platforms like Spark, Impala, you had Splice Machine, and a bunch of other platforms that could enable that kind of a functionality. And I think that in some way, and this was all 2012, 2013, I think that was breakthrough in terms of companies that had made big data investments, but could now start getting some real value out of it, because now business analysts could hook up with it, run their familiar SQL queries, get some answers for the business, right? Your familiar BI tools could hook up with it and then start getting some value, right? So that was around 2012. In my mind, that was like the third generation of data platforms, right? Or depending on how you count.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No. So where I'm going with this, and I think this is all really valuable setup. So in my experience, what's ended up happening in large corporations like Carrier, and part of what I want to get to for our audience is, okay, as a data and analytics leader, like, how do we manage the strategy for this? So what I've observed is everything that you just said still exists. Right. So what's happened, like, there are breakthrough platforms and they are revolutionary, but almost nobody who had traditional EDW or enterprise warehousing has gotten rid of their high ceremony data warehouses that are used for things like statutory financial reporting. You get into a multinational that's, a portfolio company like yours, and my guess is, I don't know, but I'll ask you, you must have all of these things, right? They're all trying to coexist at the same time. So, from an organizational and technology strategy standpoint, this is like what, 5 years ago, everyone was talking about multimodal IT. This is like multimodal data and analytics, but on steroids. And it's almost like the more things come in, the more complicated our lives get. So one, do you kind of agree with that as a problem statement? And then two, like, what are some insights you'd share as, someone who's got accountability for these platforms? Like, how do you start untangling that and focusing on the things that are valuable without, without putting a stake in the heart of these like very expensive, capital intensive, ceremonious data warehouses that are still being used for, critical purposes, often with a regulatory reporting component? I know that was like 18 questions all at once, but that was sort of why I wanted to go through that setup, because I think this is a really interesting challenge that, it's every large enterprise I've worked in is facing a version of this. And I think you've got a unique perspective on it, with your deep knowledge of that whole history.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Chris. I think that's a fantastic question. Like you said, 18 questions in one. So
that's okay. If you get 3 or 4 answers, that'll be great.
Yes, I'll answer them one by one. Just for completing my thought on the platform evolution, I think the final stop on that journey was again what we today call cloud data warehouses, right? So we started with data warehouses and we ended with data warehouses, right? So I think after the whole uh,
True.
uh,
Yeah.
SQL on big data platforms, I think there was realization that SQL is not going anywhere. Right? If you have to have mainstream adoption, if you have to have enough skilled resources to be able to work the environment, then SQL has to be an integral part of it. Right? And so around 2014, 2015, you had Snowflake and Redshift come into the market, right? Truly cloud data warehouses. Like Snowflake brought in the concept of separating storage and compute, which was absolutely revolutionary at that time, right? Being able to scale the component of your warehouse that you need to scale independent of the other was a paradigm shift from how we were thinking about it up until that point, right? And so again, fast forward a few years, if you look at what's the popular design pattern now, it is Hadoop, in some sense, has gone away or is not the most popular choice now. Right? Most organizations use their object store as the cloud object store as the data lake platform, if you will. Right? So if you AWS S3 or Azure Object Store, right, that's where they bring in all kinds of data, maintain as much history as they need, and then only the processed high value data gets pushed into your uh, cloud data warehouse. So that could be a Snowflake, that could be a Redshift, that could be a BigQuery, that could be a Azure Synapse Analytics, whatever it is. Right? And so that's broadly that's where we are in terms of platform evolution today. Now to your second question, right? Go to any large organization, uh, most of them would have gone through several cycles of IT
Yeah.
evolution.
Yeah.
As in regional ITs, and so there was a time when every part of IT was doing their own thing. There was no
Yeah.
single standard across the enterprise. Other companies grew through M&A, so they have a plethora of technologies and plethora of EDWs and data lakes and whatnot. And so uh, I think the prudent way to manage that is to firstly understand that there will always be multiple platforms, right? And that's part of the multimodal conversation, but that's also more importantly understanding that there are different businesses within a large company, and each of them have differing priorities, right? So if I have to take our example, Carrier has three core businesses, right? We are in the HVAC business, refrigeration business, and fire and security business, right? Each of these are pretty large businesses of their own. They could be an independent company. I mean,
Yeah.
HVAC is about a $10 billion business. Refrigeration and fire and security are both between $4 and $5 billion, right? And so each of them legitimately have their own data and analytics needs, which could be very different from the rest of the organization, right? And so my data and analytics strategy is a two-level strategy. There's a BU level strategy, which is around maintaining a separate BU level data ecosystem for each of these areas, right? Because the BU level needs are much broader than the few common enterprise level needs we have, right? And then the common enterprise needs might be your headquarters finance wanting to look across all of the businesses and uh, things of that nature, right? I mean, there are a few use cases like that as well, right? And so the way we are set up, I've got a SAP HANA ecosystem that supports our HVAC business. I've got a AWS plus Snowflake ecosystem that supports our refrigeration business. I've got a AWS plus Snowflake setup that supports our fire and security business. And then I've got AWS and Snowflake for supporting our enterprise needs, right? So four data ecosystems. And the way I make sure that this doesn't lead to problems is by ensuring that the source of the enterprise data ecosystem is the BU level data warehouses, right? And the advantage of doing that is that now whatever the BU level leaders are looking at in terms of numbers, those are the exact same numbers that are getting rolled up to the world headquarters, right? So there is no more ticking and tying needed, or different kinds of calculations happen, or different kinds of rounding happen, kind of problems, right? And so the BU level data warehouses, they are responsible for hooking up with all of the ERP systems and other systems at the BU level, right? And creating a single view for the BU, and then they're also responsible for feeding their BU specific information into the enterprise level view.
So this is really, that's awesome. I love what you're saying. And I just want to play it back and make sure I understand correctly. So what I'm hearing you say in a sense is that you've created an IT and a data strategy that is closely tied to the ownership and governance strategy, right? So I'm the business unit leader. Ultimately, I own the numbers that I'm responsible for. And when that gets all rolled up, then, nothing has changed. So there's not this sort of thing that happens, the back and forth that happens in corporate versus line of business disconnects, which is a pretty common problem.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So multiple data platforms are not essentially bad as long as you have a governance model in mind, and as long as you have a good way of linking numbers they report with the numbers you want to roll up at the corporate level.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense, and I think it's a good insight too, because I've just seen, without naming names, I've seen too many companies where it's like you sort of have some platform that's a shiny object and you try to make it do too much. And I think what you're saying is just keep it simple, right? You're always going to have multiple platforms. There's no shopping mall where you're going to get everything, and you got to figure out how to make that work, which I've had in my mind, been in this metaphor for a long time that you could think of architecture at different levels, almost like city planning, right? Like it has some constraints, and if you've got a river running through the city, you're not going to move the river, right? So you kind of work, you work within that set of constraints, and then you create services that are meaningful to the citizens who live in the city. I like, thank you for touching a little bit on the carrier lines of business, because I always like in these conversations to get a little bit of an industry flavor. So, maybe in kind of our closing segment, I understand that within those lines of business, your organization also supports the AI agenda. And you've got, these different lines of business, and you've got your strategy, which I think you laid out very clearly. So, can you touch on, maybe a couple of use cases or interesting areas where you've helped drive business value for AI, and then, if it makes sense, given your data strategy, what's your experience been in sort of scaling those out of the lab and into an industrial scale?
Yeah, no, great question. And then I'm gonna give a slightly broader answer to that, because I think
Please, yeah.
The question you asked is applicable to not just AI, but also to data and analytics, and as it pertains to my strategy, right? So there's, in my mind, there's two legs to my strategy, right? One leg is what's our big picture vision? What do we want to do, right? And second is how do we do it, right? The how do we do it is what I described, right? Each BU will have its own BU level data ecosystem, and then we also have an enterprise data ecosystem, and that way we are able to meet each business where it is in terms of its data and analytics journey, and also in terms of their immediate priorities and medium and long term priorities, right? The first aspect is the more direct answer to your immediate question, right? So which is the big picture view of where we want to get to is three core pillars, if you will, right? So we have enterprise intelligence as one pillar, right? And enterprise intelligence is all about how do I empower every part of my business with operational and financial health insights, right? This is everyone from engineering and R&D to sales and marketing to after sales service, right? And every part of our business, from HVAC to fire and security to refrigeration, and also our corporate functions, right? So that's the enterprise intelligence piece, pretty straightforward. And then part of it is, of course, also giving them the ability to do things like demand forecasting, cash flow forecasting, etc. Right?
Yeah, makes sense.
The second pillar is what I like to call ecosystem intelligence, right? And so how do you look beyond the four walls of your organization and into your larger ecosystem, right? So your supplier on one side and your customer on the other side. For carrier, the customer often is our distributor, right? And so it's about how do we put in place analytics that help our larger ecosystem operate as one single organization and optimize the supply chain end to end, right? And so a couple of interesting examples I want to share is the supplier performance dashboard that we have, right? And there, the purpose of it is to allow our 1100 plus suppliers to directly understand how they are performing for us in terms of on-time deliveries. Example of interesting program we delivered is called uh, COLDS, or Customer Orders and Logistics Tracking System. Right? Basically, what it is it's a system that allows our customers to directly look at and understand where in the supply chain is their order. Right? So, is it at the factory? Is it at the distribution center? Is it already on a truck? If it's on a truck, what exactly is getting shipped to them? And so, this particular initiative was, in a sense, transformational. Right? Before this solution, they would have to call up a customer service representative, and that person would have to look at 8 or 10 application screens, make a few phone calls, right, and look at a ERP system, a CRM system, the logistics system, call a logistics manager, a few other people before they could give that answer, right? So it would take, giving an answer would take anywhere from 1 day to 1 week, right? And from there, now our customers don't even need to call us. They just need to log into this dashboard and they know exactly.
That's awesome. And going back, I did a lot of work in this area myself, and it's people do all these studies, and I'd always be like, look, there's a reason when you go to Amazon and you go into the inquiry, the first thing is called "Where's my stuff?" Because mainly, like, when customers are calling, what they want to know is where's my stuff. So I love that. What I understand is it's sort of like, available to promise, self-service with details, reaching back into the supply lines, which is awesome. I mean, that's really significant from a customer standpoint. I love it.
Right. And there are additional insights we want to add to that view. Like if the order still in process, we want to share a prediction of by when can they expect to receive the order, right? And that's the other thing that as a customer, I would like to know, right? So that's some interesting work happening in that area. The third pillar of our big picture vision is what I like to call product intelligence, right? A lot of our products are IoT enabled. And so this is really about streaming in all of that IoT data and enabling all kinds of insights, from insights that can power product innovation, to insights that can help us optimize our warranty costs, to insights that can help our service technicians understand what the potential issue is even before they reach the customer side, right? And so really looking at data like diagnostic data coming from devices, energy consumption data coming from devices, what are the components that are failing most often, and so how do we use that to inform our R&D spend and R&D focus, etc. So that's the product analytics pillar. So broadly, that's how we are looking at building out and rolling out solutions.
I mean, this is awesome, and I really like you're hitting on what I would consider to be, many of the key components of a, thoughtful data strategy and thoughtful implementation, because, you're looking at cost optimization and ops optimization on the supply side. You're looking at what do my customers care about, and then you're looking at, innovation and customer uptime, and all of that on the product intelligence side. And that's kind of enabled through the how of the strategy. So I think that's awesome. It's a really good model. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I just recall the second part of your question was probably how do we take it from a proof of concept stage to industry?
Yeah, right. And I just always like to talk about this with folks working in AI and data science, because again, my experience is that it's pretty easy to create something that is like a point of use, like, oh, I found some value, but then somehow it often seems like it's not much better than doing it on an Excel spreadsheet, and that companies really struggle to scale. So I'm just sort of interested, are there, 2 or 3 factors that, as you've brought these things, and the examples you gave are very compelling, like, that were accelerants to scale those out of the lab and, to the industrial level?
Yeah, no, and so the way we look at that problem, I think you hit home on a very common problem across the industry, right? Which is lot of AI and ML proof of concepts, but very few of them
Yeah.
actually make it to production, right? And I think the most common reasons are because data scientists or the folks working on a proof of concept often underestimate the complexity in getting access to cleansed, validated, transformed data at scale. Right? It's
Yes.
one thing getting a small data set in Excel for the purposes of a proof of concept, and it's completely another having to hook up to, say, in our case, we have 150 plus ERP systems across the company, and then we have 900 plus applications across the company, right? And so getting data from across a complex landscape like that at scale uh, is a huge endeavor in itself, right? And I think the number one reason projects fail is lack of recognition that that's the case, right?
I 100% agree. And just to tie back to something else that came up a couple times in the conversation, right? Like this whole, sort of deep history of data warehousing, that sort of a simple view is that of that is like, well, okay, they're the platforms, but then there's like more and more and more data. So everyone's got a neat idea about, oh, I'm going to take my IoT data and my customer data, but the complexity of that validated scalable data set is growing exponentially as we get more data in more places, and we need to solve that three V's problem that you alluded to before.
Yep, no, totally agree, Chris. And then the other common theme in the failure of such projects that I've seen is underestimating the amount of training that a fully industrialized solution will need to be able to perform at a certain level of accuracy at scale, right? So again, same thing, right? A small data set, training it on a
Yeah.
small
Yeah.
data set and ensuring accuracy versus training on at enterprise scale and having feedback loops that will keep recalibrating the model at enterprise scale. Those are like two very different things, right?
Yeah, they're very different, and that's a good point too, because I've seen that as well. And I mean, of course, what happens in real life, like once you get the models up and running, they're I'm speaking in non-technical terms, they're kind of more black swans and gray swans that are corner cases in the data sets than people realize when they do it in the lab. And that's fine as long as the stakeholders understand, and as long as you've got what in our ERP days we used to call error handling, right? You've got an exception management process, like, hey, I kicked this thing out because it doesn't fit. I don't want to just jam it back into the model. Somebody's got to take a look at that and understand how to tune it. And I think there's often a story that is highly automated, but it ain't highly automated, right? Like that takes AI folks and data scientists to go back and kind of look at that and adjudicate all of those corner cases. So I'm with you on those. That the third one that I sort of often cite is people doing it without a clear business purpose, right? So like, let's go do some AI stuff and it'll be cool, but they don't really have buy-in and they don't know what they're doing. So, like many things, right? It's, there's kind of a process problem, there's a data problem, and there's a people problem.
Exactly. I think you nailed it on the head, right? And so when they do it without a clear view of why they're doing it, what happens is after the proof of concept, it becomes very difficult to integrate it into the business process and into the business flow that it was meant to be a part of, right? And so adoption, change management, integration, all of those become a challenge, right? And so really my 2 cents on that whole topic is if you start with an understanding of these three challenges, and if you have the right flying formation or the right team to handle these three challenges as you think about going from POC to industrialization, then my experience is you will see a lot more success than the typical industry AIML project.
Yeah, that's perfect. I agree, and I think that's probably a great point to close on. This was a terrific conversation. Thank you so much for coming, for sharing your strategy. I really liked how that discussion evolved from sort of that history, into what's your strategy, and then into some very practical applications, and how leaders can can leverage your experience and scale these things up.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, some very interesting questions. I can say I absolutely enjoyed this conversation.
Terrific conversation, Binu. Thank you so much. I think that if I could share with our audience a piece of guidance, we heard a lot of wisdom here on history, how to build a strategy, and then some scaling challenges to watch out for. So thank you again for joining me today. I hope you have a great rest of the day. And for our audience, we have some additional interviews at cdomagazine.tech. Although I have to say this was one of my favorites.
Thank you, Chris.